I'm the executive director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. We are a nonprofit and nonpartisan international affairs think tank operating in the United States and Canada, dedicated to promoting diplomacy, dialogue, prudent realism, and military restraint. Today, we're going to talk about the implications of Russian invasion of Ukraine on US-China relations. For this discussion, we have a distinguished panel of 4 experts. Thank you to all of them for giving us their time and the opportunity to hear their perspectives. And Dr. Wenran Jiang, our advisor at IPD, is going to lead this discussion. But before I hand over the floor to Dr. Jiang and let him introduce the panelists, let me ask and invite every one of you to check out the upcoming conference that our organization is hosting called the Middle East Strategy Forum. It's the 2nd annual Middle East Strategy Forum that we are organizing, and this year it's going to happen in person in Ottawa. To get more information, please go to www.peacediplomacy.org/MESF2022. We're going to put that link in the chat box here as well. Please go to that link and look at the program. We have over 40 speakers joining us from the United States, Canada, Europe, and from the region, from the Middle East as well, who will talk about the different geopolitical issues impacting the region. And we expect over 250 to 300 people to attend in person. So please go to that website, check out the conference program, the list of speakers, and if you would like to join us, you can register through that link. Thank you very much. Dr. Jiang, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Bijan. Good morning, everyone. As Bijan mentioned, important and large and rich forum on the Middle Eastern issues are coming up with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. And today, I'm also very, very privileged to host another session of the ongoing IPD China conversation series, and we have covered the war in Ukraine quite extensively in the past couple of months. And we have been talking about Canada-China, US-China relations, Chinese foreign policy in many of our recorded live sessions. And we also have many experts writing. So go to IPD's website, peaceanddiplomacy.org. Today we're talking about the impact of Russia-Ukraine war on US-China relations, and something has been discussed very extensively by many people around the world. And I'm very happy to see several of the experts in the United States and China joining us today. And from Beijing, Dr. Henry Wang Huiyao, and he is the president of the Center for China and Globalization. Welcome, Henry, late at night in Beijing. Thank you for joining us again. And then we also have Dr. Michael Swain, who is still not quite online, but he will join us from Washington, D.C. momentarily, and he is the director of Quincy Institute's East Asian program. And then we have now with us Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick, who is actually joining us from New York and professor of political science at Montclair State University and a senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. And of course, she is also a senior research scientist at the Center for Naval Analysis, which is based in Washington, D.C. And the last but not least, Professor Robert Ross, who is, again, welcome to the program again. You've been here with us before. Professor of Political Science at Boston College and associate at the Harvard University's John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. And we have many things on the table, many issues to discuss, and therefore, while we wait for Dr. Michael Swine to join us, let's start maybe with Dr. Wang Huiyao, who is joining us from Beijing. And we have about an hour and 15 minutes, but if we have many, I can see many people are joining us, a couple of 100 here registered and plus. And I will simply ask each one of you to start maybe a 5 minutes observation. And then we follow with some interactive discussions between all the panelists and myself. And later on, we bring our audience in if they have questions, and feel free to write in the question section, and we will ask on your behalf. I will ask the questions on your behalf to our panelists. So now, Henry, welcome to the program again. You are now the only now panelist from China. So we have other three experts from the United States. Give us a sense from Beijing, what is going on in the mind of the elite policymakers, official or non-official, from what you know, because you have many positions yourself. You are appointed by the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang in 2015 as a state councilor. I understand that's a non-official advisory role, but nevertheless, directly talking to the Premier of China. And you are also Vice Chairman of China Association for International Economic Cooperation under the Ministry of Commerce. And you have written recently in New York Times. You have many other titles, and you have written many books. You have been affiliated with Harvard, with Asia Pacific Foundation, with other places. So give us a sense from where you are. You have done recently very notable high-level conversations with experts around the world. So tell us about the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, finally, for the long introduction, on China's perception of the United States and Sino-American relations. Floor is yours. Maybe 5 minutes, give us a sense. At the same time, welcome Dr. Michael Swine, who has just joined us. We'll come to you later. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Wenzan. Yeah, it's really a great honor to join this distinguished panel and tonight. And I think that the topic is really relevant. Actually, it's really highly people are highly attentive these days. I think that U.S.-China relations among war in Ukraine is really probably a very timely subject, as we can see that now this war has broken out for over 2 months now, and it's greatly changed the world landscape and probably changed forever. And also, the globalization really has a big setback. We have been since last 77 years, since the Bretton Woods system being established. In the last 77 years, we have seen a world progress and prosperous, and hundreds of times of increase in trade and prosperity, and also biggest in Asia, and China is one of the also great stories on that. So the early system, like the U.S. used to lead on this system, like a World Bank, IMF, WTO, and first generation of global governance, is now the U.S. is not really that kind of active. The U.S. has created the TPP, has threatened to quit WTO, and then shifted more attention now on the actually secure lines. I mean, we see NATO has been really strengthened, has expanded 5 times, in the East world, and also we have seen the 5 eyes of more tightening cooperation, and then we have seen AUKUS is more focused on the nuclear submarine. I mean, in Pacific region, and then we see Quad, whereas probably a mini NATO is established in there, a security alliance as well. So that kind of trend is really alarming and also not really healthy, I think, because I think the world is really needs to be more continue the upgrade on the economic side, because we see that RCEP has been taking off, the largest free trade agreement, and then we see that China is really wants to promote in the economic globalization. So I think there's some NATO is led by U.S. So Sino-U.S. relation is really affecting this China-U.S. relations in many ways, and so I think how can we really got that is really a key issue. So this Ukraine is just a battleground. It's really Russia against NATO probably, and China is the only country that not involved in both ways. And so there's quite a lot of the role that probably China can play to mediate this conflict. What I think China has been doing is probably should be more emphasized in the future. For example, really focus on economic. China contributes over 1/3 of global GDP growth, and China now is really launching this big Belt and Road Initiative, is more economic initiative. China has set up AIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that really infrastructure now has become a common, really consensus of all US, EU now. Everybody wants to do infrastructure. B3W or EU Global Gateway. And now we have also RCEP, which is trade effective, and then China's trade with ASEAN now become the largest trading partner. And also, of course, China wants to join CPTPP, a trade scheme designed by the US. So China wants to upgrade. And also China has signed a big investment treaty with EU. And China is doing a big cooperation agreement with African, and then of course on the pandemic fighting and many other things. So what I'm saying is that, of course, there's many different views on China-US relations, and also different views on the Ukraine and China, position. But I think this economic alliance versus the military secure alliance probably is more important than that's really can secure our integration, prosperity, and really connecting us together rather than dividing. Now every country is driving up a military budget, which is not healthy. So just to conclude, I want to say that I understand, there's concern, there's worries, but let's really expand the economic cooperation rather than the military cooperation or security alliance. This is the key to solve those issues. China does not, export, refugee or famine, or China contribute over 1/3 of GDP growth. So probably, China has never sent a soldier anywhere in the world, never colonized any places. China is always a peace-loving country. So I think, we probably should really focus more on economics rather than military. Because unfortunately, I think this war happened in Ukraine, which is, of course, China has said very strongly that any country's integrity and sovereignty should be respected. Ukraine is no exception. So that is already very strong. And even though there's a friendship with US, with Russian, but there's a bottom line. There's a UN charter and UN principles there. So that position has been made very clear. So I think that China does not support Russia economically or militarily. I think that China is in a good position to help the international community to seek a peaceful end to the crisis. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Henry. I do notice that you clarified further about the Chinese position on the sovereignty of Ukraine. And I think also the dilemma that China and Russia is having a very close relationship. I also noted that you have emphasized very much about common prosperity, China's economic contribution to the world as well. But there are people who actually, especially in the past couple of months, would argue with you that the national survival or national security issues will override economic and prosperity issues. And supremacy and security may actually be a value that can, based on some sacrifice of economic related benefits. But let's get back to those issues later. I want to now move to Dr. Michael Swine, who is joining us from Washington, D.C., and he's the director of Kwanzaa Institute's East Asia program. And before that, he was worked for many years at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he worked nearly 20 years there, actually, as a senior fellow specializing in China's defense and foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and East Asia international relations. He also served as a senior policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. He has many accomplishments. I'm not going to go into the detailed list. Michael, welcome back to the IPD program. Now you heard what Henry just talked from Beijing, telling us about his take on the overall Russia-Ukraine war and its impact on U.S.-China relations. What's happening in Washington, D.C. about all this U.S. lawmakers' condemnation of China, demanding China taking the side? And what do you see the trend going? Give us an overview if you could. You need to put on your audio. Yeah, thank you. We still do not seem to have your audio, Michael. Just see if our administration can do something.
Can you hear me now?
Now we got it. It got tricky sometimes. Yep.
Yeah, but it's echoing.
Perfect. Thank you.
Can you hear me without an echo?
You have echo now.
I'm very sorry about this. Hold on one second. Is that better?
Oh, yes. Now you were good. Yeah.
I'm sorry for all this. I recently had some security protocols that had been put on my computer, on my desktop, and it's completely screwed up my ability to link into different things. Okay. So I'm going to have to fix that in the future. Right now, I've kind of jury-rigged this thing. I'm working through my iPad here, so right. I hope it comes through clear enough. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Wenaf, for this invitation, and it's good to be with you all here. As far as the United States is concerned and its view of all of this, I think the United States right now is seeing China in the Ukraine context as trying to straddle the fence, but on balance, really maintaining strong support for Russia. And this has real implications for future great power relations, and it places us to some degree at an inflection point. I think the situation is more serious, broadly speaking, in terms of power relations than Huiyao might suggest. I think that the United States really feels that China is really trying to support Russia in basically an unsupportable war in some ways. It's not condemned Russia's invasion. It's criticized the use of sanctions. It's referred to Russia's legitimate security concerns. And it's also supported what I think is Russia's absurd claims about the US bioweapons labs in the Ukraine. All of these things obviously are aggravating attitudes both in the United States and elsewhere, I think, towards Russia's position. I think the US also sees China, though, as hesitant to fully back Russia. It didn't vote against the condemnation of Russia. It abstained in the United Nations. It has not violated sanctions in any explicit way thus far, and it has not provided military weapons to Russia. So I think for the United States, it even though it disapproves very much about what China's position is on Ukraine, at the same time, it is not going full bore in really criticizing China. It's warned China of dire consequences if it does violate sanctions or if it does aid Russia militarily. Now, some people might argue that the US sees few costs for itself, regardless of what China does. If it backs Russia more fully, it will clarify the strategic competition that is going on in the US view between authoritarianism and democracy and great power competition. But if China backs away from Russia, it will then weaken both Putin and possibly China as well. So some people might think that for the United States, it's kind of a win-win, regardless of what China does. But I think that would be a miscalculation. And I really don't think that is the case, since Chinese support for Russia, even if Putin greatly escalates the war, could lead to much more dire consequences. So I don't think the United States thinks that Chinese behavior is really going to benefit it, regardless of what China does. Now, as far as what is the larger impact on US-China relations, I think that certainly it's not been positive. The Ukraine war has had, on balance, a very negative effect. The discussion between Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi recently really didn't produce much other than US warnings in a public way, which I think made it more difficult for the Chinese to respond to them, because doing this publicly really puts them on the spot in some ways. And I think that the Xi-Biden meeting that occurred didn't really seem to change anything. I think both China and the US have provided really few, if any, positive signals toward one another during this conflict. The animosity between the two countries and the suspicion, I think, continues, and arguably continues to deepen. Now, I think the long-term impact on US-China relations depends to a great extent still on what happens in the Ukraine war. My guess is that Beijing will continue to try and straddle the fence while not condemning Putin and leaning towards Putin, and still blame the US for the war by and large, unless Putin uses WMD in the conflict or he attacks a NATO state, such as Poland. Now, the Chinese might still dither even then and try to straddle, but how much will depend on whether and how much they aid Putin and how the US reacts to China's continued dithering in the face of these kinds of developments. But you could get a very worst case kind of situation where, despite Putin's escalation of the conflict, if that were to occur in major ways, and if China doesn't really come out then and say this is too much, then you could get some movement in the United States towards China that could be very bad and very destabilizing. And I mean by that, movement on Taiwan, where you could get the United States saying, look, the Chinese are clearly in Putin's camp on this. It doesn't matter, even if he escalates this situation to the brink of even possibly nuclear conflict, the Chinese are still going to back the Russians no matter what. And this shows that China is willing to take aggressive actions in its own backyard, and that would be regarding Taiwan. Therefore, the argument would go, the United States needs to radically increase its support for Taiwan and back away from, if not end, the one China policy, because we need to deter the Chinese from doing what Putin has just done in Ukraine. And that argument, if that would hold sway in the United States, could become extremely dangerous, because China would be forced to react to it. And we would be into a confrontation over Taiwan that I think has the potential to make the Ukraine war look like a sideshow. And so we have to be very careful here about how we interact on these issues, and that China really needs to think hard about its own position towards the Ukraine war. I think the Chinese position is fundamentally rooted in the concept that its major strategic perspective here is vis-a-vis the United States. And the United States is the country that could end up with greater leverage on China as a result of the Ukraine war. Therefore, the United States must keep focused on that issue. But I think China really needs, to some degree, to reassess that position and test whether or not the United States really is so implacably opposed to China. And by the same token, I think the United States needs to reassess its stance towards China and give it more positive reasons for it to be more helpful and supportive in the Ukraine war situation. So both sides, I think, need to reassess their approaches to some degree, and hopefully develop a more stable basis for interaction as we go forward in this Ukraine war situation. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, Michael, thank you very much for that very sober assessment. And you're very direct in putting a number of things on the table. I'm pretty sure our other panelists, especially Henry, would like to respond. Just hold on for now. Let me move to Professor Elizabeth Withernick, who is, Wishnick, Professor Wishnick, who is joining us from New York, as I introduced earlier. Elizabeth, I noticed you have a China resource risk blog. You wrote actually several weeks prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine about what potentially you called Ukraine might become a burning bridge for China to Europe, an issue that's not as discussed as much. Can you give us a sense, because you are following both China and Russia very closely, and you speak both languages, and you have a book, I understand, coming out with the Columbia University Press, focusing on China's risk on energy, water, food, and regional security. Much of those subjects is related to the current war in Ukraine and its potential impact on US-China relations. So can you maybe give us a sense about what you've been writing about and what's your take on this subject?
Well, first, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with the other distinguished speakers and my first discussion at your institute. So I just like to start off by saying we're not talking about a war in Ukraine. We're talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is a sovereign state, as our first speaker noted, that China recognized and still recognizes as a sovereign state. And so I think that is an important fact in trying to understand how the world reacts to the invasion of a peaceful sovereign neighbor in Europe. And I would say that I agree with Michael Swain on that China is focusing more on its strategic interests. So despite what Henry Wang said about the need to focus on economic interests and globalizations, that's not China's policy. In fact, the policy that China has been employing is seen as providing implicit support for Russia at the expense of China's own economic interests. And you know, that's what I've been examining in some of my recent writing. And China had invested in Ukraine. For example, the port of Mariupol that's been bombed to smithereens was a port where China had invested in dredging to expand the port for its own use. China has been investing in other ports in Ukraine, seeing Ukraine as an important source of grain exports. Chinese agricultural companies had invested, and probably the biggest investment was a Xinjiang energy company, Xinjiang Beikan Energy, which has a partnership with a Ukrainian gas company in Poltava, which is being bombed by Russia. So China is losing economically. It had been building up an economic relationship with Ukraine for the past several years and saw Ukraine as an important component of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that BRI, which is a centerpiece of Xi Jinping's economic program, is now suffering, not just from COVID disruptions. We've been following the situation in Shanghai with the lockdowns, which have caused a lot of delays in shipping in terms of the port of Shanghai. Well, maritime trade is affected, and now rail trade is affected because the northern BRI route goes through Belarus, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and so on. And in fact, right before Putin came to to Beijing for the opening of the Winter Games. The president of Poland was there talking about the Belt and Road initiative and how it was going to go along this route to Poland. And so that route is not operable because shippers don't want to go through Russia. They've pulled out, big shippers like Maersk and DHL and so on. And so now trade has to be rerouted to the south, which is less compatible because of it has not been the traditional route. So you need to have more investment in terminals and so on. And this could also reorient China's Belt and Road more to the maritime dimension, could increase China's ties to Iran, for example. It could highlight a whole host of other developments which would have an impact on US-China relations, as well as on China's economy. So I would say if China sincerely thinks that the world should be focusing more on economic interests, then that is not the policy that it is employing. But I would say that there's another dimension to this policy, and that is a domestic one. I think that Michael's right about the strategic aspect, focusing on the competition with the US in this conflict is an aspect of China's policy. But I think perhaps an equally significant one is the aspect of regime security, that China is very concerned about the fate of Putin in all of this. Xi Jinping himself is personally invested in the relationship with Putin, having met with him 38 times. I mean, I think it's hard to go back from this policy because he's been so personally invested in it, and he's facing the 20th Party Congress in the fall, and he can't say his Russia policy was failed. I mean, I think it's very difficult for China to change this policy. And also, I think there's some sympathy about the Putin's aim to reconstitute some form of the Soviet Union, which by all accounts, Xi Jinping also thinks was a great disaster and has many lessons for China's political situation. So I think it's a kind of intractable problem, and I think Chinese policy is quite counterproductive for its own economic interests as well as for its relationship with the United States.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Very interesting. You raised the point of whether the Chinese government is actually defending its own economic interests in this case. People tend to think of bigger strategic context of closeness of Russia-China relations. You seem to indicate this might become President Xi's liability when pushing forward with future Belt and Road Initiative and other aspects. In a sense, it's actually the war undermines China's own long-held position of integration of global economic trade. We'll pick up that and maybe get others to respond. Let me move to Professor Robert Ross, who joined us. I believe we're from Boston, right?
Yes, I am.
Yes. And you have written very extensively in your capacity as the professor on strategic and military and many other issues. You've heard the rest of the panelists. So what is your take, if I may ask you to focus a little bit on the broader strategic context and the military side? Michael mentioned Taiwan, which everybody's talking about. Even people say they're not comparable officially, but it is comparable. We know that. Everybody's drawing lessons about what this means for US-China relations over Taiwan. So go ahead, Bob, give us your assessment.
Thank you very much, Ron. First, let me just add a little bit on the context of Ukraine for China. And I think the underlying politics of this is that I think we should all understand that the American involvement in the Ukraine conflict does not primarily reflect American humanitarian concerns, but American security concerns for the expansion of Russian influence on the borders of NATO. So this is a security issue, less a humanitarian issue for the United States. There are many humanitarian crises around the world the United States does not pay attention to. This one matters because it's in Europe. So then we're asking the Chinese for assistance and support against Russia regarding a security issue, which is a little rich, if you will, because after all, we all know the United States launched a trade war and a tech war under the Trump administration. The Biden administration has an explicit objective to create a global coalition against China. And we have improved relations with Taiwan. And then we say to China, help us on our security interests. It's a tall order. It's a big ask. And of course, the Chinese are not prepared to help us when we have been confrontational with China. So this is a political issue in US-China relations, not a humanitarian issue. Now, Michael is right. The Chinese need to balance these security issues with their interests in US-China relations and regarding Europe. So some say China needs to have a balanced relationship. My own perspective is that China wants to do as little as possible to help the United States without harming its own interest. And its interest, as Michael suggests, is not to give greater ammunition to those on the right and on the left in the United States who want to up support for Taiwan. And with regard to Europe, there is a trade agreement, an investment agreement, I should say, sitting on the table of the EU that is in limbo. And China still hopes that that investment agreement will be passed by the EU, ratified by the EU. And so it has to maintain that interest in Europe as well. And of course, we should also understand that China is in some respects a beneficiary, not in every respect, but a beneficiary of America's ongoing inability to extract itself from conflicts elsewhere in the world. You talk about a pivot to East Asia, and yet every time we talk about trying to pivot to East Asia, it's a conflict in the Middle East, and now a conflict in Europe. And once again, China is watching the United States unable to focus on the rise of China. So it's a complex situation here that reflects politics and interests, less humanitarian. And I think all of us who study realism and understand international relations would not be surprised by that. Regarding Taiwan, there is this growing interest in how the war in Ukraine affects the cross-strait relations within Taiwan. In some respects, American concern and perhaps alarm for Chinese ambitions reflects a perspective that says that one, Chinese may take advantage of the situation in Ukraine to launch something against Taiwan. But second, it also suggests that if America does not sustain its deterrent posture against the mainland will feel free to use force for unification. And both those perspectives are misplaced. The situation in Taiwan is vastly different. And simply because the United States is preoccupied with Ukraine doesn't mean it's easy for China to invade Taiwan. So just to give an alternative example, the United States never faced a deterrent from Russia to invade Cuba since the end of the Cold War. And it doesn't do so because the price of war is high, regardless of the absence of a deterrent from another power. Well, the same is true for China. The logistical demands of an amphibious operation on the east coast of Taiwan are vastly different than the ability of Russia to cross its borders with an army. And then I think we all understand that the people in Taiwan, at minimum, do not like the Chinese Communist Party and could be expected to resist any effort by the mainland to occupy Taiwan in a geography that is perfectly suited to a protracted warfare by the people on Taiwan. And then third, a protracted war might be devastating for the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party on the mainland. That is far more powerful than deterrent to Chinese use of force in the United States, because the United States' ability to intervene in the Taiwan conflict has been declining over the last 10, 20 years. Now, particularly when we think about one implication of the war in Ukraine, is when Joe Biden says, we will not engage Soviet aircraft over Ukraine for fear of escalation with another nuclear power. That sure sounds like Taiwan to me. We just replaced the word Ukraine with the word Taiwan, and we have the United States will not engage with another nuclear power over the airspace of Taiwan for fear of escalation of nuclear war. And of course, the naval balance that's been shifting for the last 20 years is another source of undermining American resolve and American credibility and commitment to defend Taiwan with intervention. So that's been declining over time. So the primary source of intervention is the ambiguity over whether America would intervene. but also the difficulty of occupying Taiwan. Now, one of the implications of Ukraine is Taiwan's preoccupation in how to defend against the mainland occupation with declining American credibility. Now, I give President Tsai considerable credit. She is the first Taiwan leader to take seriously posing the threat to the mainland of a protracted war, and in dealing seriously with mainland military superiority in almost all aspects of high technology warfare in the Taiwan Strait compared to both Taiwan and the United States. And so we are seeing her, not just recently, but in the last year or two, emphasizing the need to prepare for protracted war through reserves, through rear military operations. And that is the most persuasive way to deter the mainland from use of force. Now, what Ukraine has done to this is two things. The threat that the people in Taiwan feel regarding a mainland occupation has made them more receptive to Tsai Ing-wen's desire to up the military budget and to focus on guerrilla warfare and enlisting the people in a more national effort to resist the mainland. And this gives her greater ability to push even faster for a people's war, protracted war policy, rather than a high-tech response to Chinese capabilities. Over the long run, this will be beneficial to Taiwan's security and beneficial to relations across the strait in absence of war. Now, what we've also seen from Tsai Ing-wen is a great reluctance to push the envelope on independence. So on the one hand, she is hugging the United States. She's expanding Taiwan's footprint around the world. She's focusing on people's war, all of which the mainland is not happy with. But she's not been challenging the status quo on Taiwan's independence policy, not since the first few years of her administration. It's a wise policy, and this is being expedited, I would suggest, by the war in Ukraine.
All right, Bob, thank you very much. And thank you for being very frank in actually detach a little bit and give a sense of what the real politics here is about, not only between China and the United States over the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also on the Taiwan dynamics. There are many things we need to cover, but I want to go back, jump back right to Henry. Can you maybe, after listening to three colleagues from the United States, can you respond in some ways to what their takes on this, on the virus issues regarding U.S.-China relations? So Henry, the floor is yours, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Winston, and thanks for the view shared. I think there's probably a big, miss that China would gain from this Ukraine-Russian conflict or this war invasion going on. But basically, China's economic interest, as I said in my New York Times op-ed, is actually 10 or 20 times larger. The China's trade with Russian and China's trade with West is 1 in 20 times. That China would not lose that big economic benefit. And China is the largest trading nation with 130 countries. I mean, just imagine the world is not really functioning well, not with this Ukraine and Russian crisis. It's greatly impacted the world. I mean, Europe is going to suffer, I'm sure, very soon now, if not now. And US is also going to be impacted as well. The whole world is going to be impacted. For example, the energy prices has all gone up, and 73% of China energy depends on import. If this Ukraine war continues, that will drive up billions, if not the trillions of extra cost to China. And also, furthermore, there's Ukraine and Russia counts about 25% of the global grain export. Again, China is one of the largest import of grain food as well. So all those is not in China's interest to see this war continue. And it's also rightly mentioned, but Belt and Road goes through Russia and the Ukraine. I mean, now it probably stopped already. The EU-China railways is not functioning that because of this war. And Ukraine is also China has good relations with Russia and Ukraine, and Ukraine is the Belt and Road signing country and has many years of good relations. So there's no interest for China to see this war continue or really China would benefit that. No, I mean, this is really bad for China. And if also just in Ukraine alone, all this infrastructure China has been putting up the airports and roads and all the other facilities, China probably lost, on the BOT basis, China already lost, that if not billion, probably 10 billion, whatever, US dollars there already, so that's a huge loss for China. So the reason that China doesn't want to see the sanction that continues to be applied, because that is not good for any country. It doesn't work anywhere in the world in history. China itself is now being sanctioned by the US. Over 1,000 companies from China is being on entity or some kind of watchable list by the US. So China has the empathy for the Russian on this sanction, because sanction doesn't work. And sanction only can bring the world into recession and will make world a chaotic place on top of pandemic, trouble crisis we're having right now. So anyway, so I think the logic is there. China doesn't want to see this war happen, and I would like to see a peaceful end. I propose as well. I mean, I see that can be worked out. P5 in the UN plus EU plus Ukraine. Why not we have a 7-party talks and talk about immediate ceasefire? And if Ukraine does not want to join NATO, and if NATO doesn't want to admit Ukraine into it, I mean, the big issue is there. Let's talk about that, and let's gradually have a peace plan for the Europe and for the security. So I think G20 or G7, whatever, or let's have a 7-party talk of P5 plus China plus EU, just like we did on the 6-party talk, would be great. I mean, would really make things further, and China would be happy to get involved, I suppose. And finally, on the issue of Taiwan, I mean, same thing. I think this Ukraine crisis in the Russian-Ukraine conflict really, serve as an alarming bell for both Taiwan and probably US and including people, everywhere in the world, because it's not going to be, this kind of hundreds of times of maneuver, Navy ships in the neighborhood of South China Sea or Taiwan Strait. China has to respond, flying over, whatever, many times. I mean, yesterday, the defense minister of US and Chinese defense minister just had phone calls because there's a lot of flying over or the visits of US congressmen, has been intensified. And that is really a provocation to the Chinese. And the status quo that we've been seeing that for the last 5 decades or 4 decades since diplomatic times. So those things, China was merely responding, basically. But it's really dangerous. If US does not want to involve in the Ukraine directly, I don't see why US wants to involve in Taiwan directly. So let's not provoke each other and then really getting things out of control, because we are really facing a very dangerous moment and the brink of the Third World War, perhaps. I mean, Russia just launched its huge long-range missile yesterday, and it's not really we're talking about just a conventional war now. It's really things can get out of control. So the rational, the common sense, and the economic common sense should return. I mean, let's really focus on that. And I think China has done is right. Focus on Belt and Road economic. Focus on economic agreements with EU and also with US. China also said wants to work with US on the B3W. Why not BRI and B3W work together? And the EU Global Gateway work together on the infrastructure. I mean, the world infrastructure is crumbling, particularly in many countries, developing countries, including developed countries. China is the best in the world. Why not we work on that? And on top of climate change and pandemic, I mean, let's all have that. So I think it's really important that we are focusing, let's getting on the big economic pies rather than the military budget, so that if that continues, I will see a very dangerous world ahead of us. Thank you.
Okay, Henry, many things on the table. Let me go to Elizabeth for a moment. But Bob, Michael, feel free to jump in on any of the points as we go along. I'm just opening this up. Elizabeth, Henry just mentioned China's economic trade linkages with the Western countries. It's just a lot larger. We're talking about, it's not on the same scale. But the reverse logic would be true because of this, because China's size and its economic importance to the Western countries, especially to the United States. Any potential damage or sanctions by the US against China for not taking, say, a position to condemn Russia, or potentially if China have more economic aids to Russia, if not war related, this could be used, especially by the US Congress. As we can see, they're looking for all sort of excuse to be getting more hostile towards China. What would be the implications for the US if you take on China in terms of whatever they call the sub-level, second level sanctions against China? Would not be hurting the United States? And can they really take that kind of hit given where things are in the US economy?
Well, I'd like to start with what Hui Wang just said about China being more invested in the West than in Russia. I do think that China does receive certain important resources from Russia, 15% of its oil and 10% of its gas, and some grains and other coal, a large growing percentage of coal because of China's difficulties with Australia and other suppliers. So I think China has an economic interest in Russia also. And I don't know that it's possible just to pretend the Russian invasion has not happened and try to cooperate with the EU in infrastructure. So I think it was quite clear at the recent meeting that the two sides were on completely different pages on that. For the EU, the Russian invasion is a serious security concern and a threat to the EU, and you can't have business as usual in this current situation. In terms of the trade piece between the US and China, I think it's going to depend on what China does in the future. I think for now, China seems to be complying with sanctions as far as we can tell. But that doesn't mean that China won't take up opportunities. So just today it was reported that the Chinese oil companies, energy companies, are investigating the stake in the Sakhalin-2 energy project that Shell pulled out of as a result of the Russian invasion. So if China starts investing, it's paused certain investments in Russia, but if it's going to start additional ones, excuse me, then that could cause some difficulties in the future between the US and China.
All right. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, finish. If you want some water, go ahead. Have some water. Let me jump over to Michael. Can you respond, Michael, by talking a little bit more about the dynamics on the US intentions here? Would the US, especially the Congress, use the war in Ukraine to push towards more of a hostile attitude towards China, if not outright sanctions? What we're looking at in terms of longer game, I mean, the Chinese must have by this point nearly a year and a half into the Biden administration, that the US may actually have a bipartisan consensus that to contain China at any cost. Is this actually your reading on this situation?
Well, I definitely think that there is now a bipartisan agreement on the contours, the outlines of what China represents to the West. And it's on balance a very negative assessment. It crosses party lines. I think the Chinese had some hope that Biden administration might be more positive in some ways, but both its own behavior and the Biden administration's own calculus, in part political calculus, I think have shown that that is not the case. And the Biden administration is pursuing a policy that is based on a very similar assessment of what China is to that of the Trump administration. And so for China, there's not a whole lot of leverage that it thinks it has in dealing with the United States on this issue. But that said, it could get much worse. And that is what I think the Chinese need to really be thinking about. It's not as if the United States has pulled out all the stops and it's in a full-blown confrontation with China across the board. There is some balance in the U.S. policy towards China. And I think it's in China's interest to play on that and not to try to really alienate even more people within the United States about China's behavior internationally. And here, the Ukraine war represents such a stark attack on the basic principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity that I think really, the Chinese have been the most strongest, arguably, proponent of this. And yet they are limited because of their fears of US pressure and implacable opposition to China. They're limited in how they respond to Putin's actions because of their need, as they see it, to remain loyal to Putin. And I take Elizabeth's point very much that there's a personal dimension to this as well, unfortunately, where I think Xi Jinping feels he's not going to turn his back on Putin. The question is, can they strike a balance? Can the Chinese strike a balance here where they really do caution, in which they do in part caution Putin against escalating this situation? Because an escalation of this war is absolutely going to run against Chinese interests. There's no question about it. And to assess the U.S. position as being the primary factor escalating the war, as some Chinese have suggested, is just absurd. I mean, Putin is the person who is escalating this war, and he's the one who could push this into a really serious confrontation that could drag the Chinese into this situation, like it or not. And yes, there are people in the Congress, I think, who are all too willing to make that conclusion and to pressure the administration in ways that I think would be very dangerous in the US-China relationship. But the Biden administration itself it has very little to work with from the point of view of China's behavior thus far. And so I think China needs to really have Huiyao just said a ceasefire would be great. Oh, yes, I totally agree. A ceasefire would be excellent. But Putin is not about to agree to. Why isn't there a ceasefire? It's primarily because Putin is still moving forward to try to destroy a large part of the Ukrainian army, to consolidate his control over Donbass, and then to increase his leverage in getting Ukraine to back down in various ways. He might have a compromise in mind in terms of not taking over all of Ukraine and not displacing the Ukrainian government, but ensuring it never joins NATO and having permanent control over Donbass. But that is not a solution to this problem. You can get a ceasefire, but it's probably going to be a very unstable ceasefire. And the Chinese shouldn't be holding out hope that that is in some way going to rectify the situation, because it will not. So, the dangers for China in this situation are great. And as a result of this, in part, there is some sign of debate, not necessarily at the very top of the Chinese government, but in other circles, and certainly among Chinese intellectuals, some of whom have actually come out and said the Chinese position on this war is simply not good for China's interests. It needs to establish some better approach to dealing with this. It's never going to throw Putin out the window, that's for sure, but it really needs to exert greater efforts to get Putin to understand what the dangers are, not just for China, but for the world, really, in escalating this situation.
All right, Michael, very, very strong argument. I would like maybe later for Henry to come back to you further, but here, also a lot of Chinese and people around the world that talk about the hypocrisy of the United States and Western countries the U.S. done a lot of invasions of other countries, and now if U.S. is using this as a moral standing, I'm not sure the persuasive power, how strong it is. I think it's more interesting to look at the strategic and economic incentives for China for its own benefits. And then, Bob, let me come to you, because both Elizabeth and Michael talk about some personal dimensions of Xi Jinping felt maybe either in a hostage situation or too much tied up with Putin. He cannot afford to kind of go down steps in backwards of condemning the war. Is that the case strategically? Because we're looking at the situation, many argue the United States want to isolate and destroy Russia in Europe, and isolate China and destroy China eventually in Asia. The fate strategically of Russia and China are in fact linked, as some people say. Would that be possible that Chinese, despite all the losses economically, Henry mentioned, Elizabeth mentioned, due to the war, may have a much clearer strategic long-term calculation that they need to stick together in order to fence off the United States? What is your take on that? And you can add anything about Taiwan that Henry mentioned. Go ahead.
First, there were a couple of questions online, perhaps I could respond to also. China has an interest in bringing this to a close as soon as possible. It's already benefited as much as it can. There's going to be a long-term freeze in Europe. Russia's going to be hostile. Europe will be hostile to Russia. American presence will be a long-term presence. China would benefit from bringing this to a close. But expectations of Chinese mediation, I think, are misplaced for a number of reasons. One, we need to recognize the more that China complies with American sanctions demand, the less it has good offices in Russia to carry out mediation. Mediation requires that you have somewhat of a neutral stance so that you have good offices in both countries. That requires China to minimize its support for American policy toward Russia. Second of all, should China succeed, it would have to reflect the conditions on the battlefield. You can't win at the negotiating table what you've already lost in the battlefield. That would require pressure on Ukraine to make most of the concessions. And you can imagine the international headlines: China sides with Russia in mediation against Ukraine, not in China's interest. And third, if it failed, well, that wouldn't be very good for China either. So at this point, there's simply no path we can foresee that China would have an interest in trying to mediate this conflict. Long term, Russia's contribution to China in dealing with America is primarily Russia's contribution to tying America down in Europe. That's done. Over the longer term, Russia is becoming weaker every day, and its ability to make a further contribution to Chinese security is declining every day. Having said that, that decline in Russia is certainly good for China in some respects, because it makes Russia increasingly reliant on China for its economy, and the growing superiority of Chinese ground forces all along the Sino-Russian border is also good for China. Now, so the long-term relationship is fairly stable. China's got no interest in backing Russia any more today than it did 2 months ago. Russia's ability to contribute more to Chinese security is less today, insofar as how weak Russia is. Rather, the status quo is about the best that the Chinese can expect. So I don't see the Ukraine conflict as transforming the China-Russian relationship to bring them closer together. As Michael has said, on the contrary, China's interest in Europe, in the United States, is going to continue to restrain China from trying to improve relations with Russia, because that will consolidate, if you will, a two-bloc world. And that is not what is in China's interest. So that we should be cautious before we draw too many conclusions about the global great power trends and the growth of Sino-Russian relations, or a two-bloc system, from the developments in Ukraine. Finally, let me make a point about China and sanctions. Yes, the United States would like China to support more sanctions. But there are 2 points here. One, if you listen closely to American policy, we are not demanding that China support American sanctions. The United States is demanding that China not undermine the sanctions that are in place. And there's a big difference. That is, if Russia is having less exports to Europe, China should not increase its exports to compensate. So the expectation, if you read between the lines, is a status quo in China-Russia economic relations. Now, having said that, there was a great decline in Chinese imports from Russia last month. So regardless, it could be because of the war and the undermine of the Russian economy, could be of Chinese decisions, but Russia is benefiting from the Chinese market less today than it did at the start of the war. Second, if you look at the number of countries supporting American sanctions around the world, it's only about 20% of the world. So to go back to this moral high ground issue, most of the world is not lining up with the United States in this one because they see this is a great power conflict, and their perspective is this is a conflict of interest in which the great powers couldn't find a way to get along. And so you don't see the world lining up with the United States. In that respect, it is important to note that India is more forward-leaning than China is in bailing out the Russians. And it is important to recognize that even the Europeans and the banking sanctions against Russia have been far less than American banking sanctions against Russia. So there's a lot of gap between American demands and the reality around the world. Having said that, we do tend to focus more on China because China matters more. And that the underlying conflict in the United States and China that preceded the war in Ukraine creates greater attention on China to not undermine American support.
Thank you, Bob. Because of the technological issues in the beginning, if all the panelists are okay, I would like to extend the session to around maybe another 10 minutes or so, because as promised, I do want to bring some of the questions on my bigger screen up there. I have the questions from the audience coming in. So all the panelists feel free to jump in because we're into the discussion with various aspects and everybody seems to contribute very deeply in a sophisticated manner. But let me summarize a couple of questions from the audience and throw that first to Henry. People ask, everybody talked about the potential sanctions or China's mediation role. I mean, if China has so much stake, Henry, as you mentioned, would like to see the end of the war, and given our audience and a number of them ask questions, China seems to be the only party, major powers are impartial. All the others, US, NATO, are in indirect way, is literally fighting, as former Ambassador Chess Freeman mentioned, the United States is quite determined to fight Russia until the last Ukraine standing. So what is China's role? People, our audience, viewers asking in terms of playing a mediation role. Others related to the question, what is the incentive for China if it does not see its mediation rules potentially not even being appreciated by the Americans or the West? What then would be China's position trying to mediate, if it comes in to mediate at all?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's a good question. As a matter of fact, we are looking at it as a war now. I mean, this war has gone mad. People started, fighting and a large scale that we haven't seen in a lifetime. So this is really terrifying, and we are facing a nuclear threat. Nuclear button is highly alert now. So what it's as I said at the beginning, it's not in nobody's interest, particularly in China's interest. China has more high skyscrapers in any other country in the world. Have half of the world high skyscrapers now in China. Infrastructure. China has the longest. Ocean bridges, have the largest dam in the world. What's the point of China sees the world going down? No, China, contributed a third of global GDP growth. But again, now, Putin has started this invasion, and then everybody said, okay, China has a good relation, but China has no military alliance with Russia. The only thing is that, of course, China is the only party not involved directly in this conflict. I was on just over the weekend with a global agenda on NHK, and in Premier, Eurasia president, he said, this is not a war, between Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between Russia and NATO. So all the EU and most of the EU and US is in direct confrontation. Ukraine is just the battleground, is the agent. China, on the other hand, is not involved in this war. So it's really a third party, not involved in both sides, and has good relations. On the one hand, has more political relation with Russia. On the other, has a more good economic relation with West. Like it or not, it's our largest trading partners. So China wants to really, make sure that this will not in China's interest this happen. But again, let's think about it. If two guys involved in the fighting, do you expect them to talk by themselves and then calm down? Just like two guys fighting in the street, you say, okay, stop fight. You two talk. I mean, it's going to escalate. It's going to get really worse, and escalate. But if there's a third party come, say, hi guys, don't fight. Let's calm down. And this guy's credible. This guy's not involved in the fighting on both sides. And then is a friend of both sides, maybe to some extent. And particularly for Putin, if he wants to gracefully calm down, if he wants to really back out of this, he needs somebody to say, okay, somebody told me to back up. Okay, I'm taking his advice. I'll give him a face to do that. He needs something like that. So I think that it's important that UN, should be safeguarded. UN Charter, UN principle, sovereignty, integrity. But let's really use UN and play some role. First, have an immediate ceasefire. Of course, ceasefire is important. Then let's have 7-party talks for a number of rounds in Geneva, elsewhere, Brussels, Washington, Moscow, Beijing. Let's really see, how we can build a lasting peace to that. But that's really important. But the utmost is really stop fighting and immediately, and have the critical player to come in to stop that. Thank you.
Henry, just very briefly to press on the point, will Chinese leadership, President Xi Jinping gave the directive saying, let's proactively engage in the mediating role to bring NATO, Russia, Ukraine together? Would China be in the position to do it? Because some people say the Chinese seem to have taken a no position and then leave it. It's a mess created by the United States. 解铃还须系铃人, whatever, who put the bell on the tiger's neck has to take it off. Is that China's position, or China is ready to be more proactive in your view?
No, I think China has. President, the day when the war broke out, President Xi spoke to Putin, said, they don't want to see the conflict. They don't think it's a good way to do it. And then President Xi talked to Macron, to German Chancellor Scholz, talked to President Biden, and Macron has been talking to Putin 10 times. Let's all the heads talk together. Let's set a table. I'm sure China will be happy to go to the table. Okay. You don't expect China to be the chief negotiator. Of course, China is not the starting of this, but China certainly the way China put in on the table. It will really calm every side's down. Absolutely, you got the balance in power there. But other than that, if just let two guys fighting and then you expect them to calm down, you don't expect that. I mean, it's difficult if they are already losing their temper and fighting continuously. It's going to be very dangerous. You need a rational guy and a credible guy and economics, strong incentive guy to do that. And I think China is happy to go with 7-party talks or UNP5 plus EU and Ukraine. Let's talk. Let's sit down, and UN Secretary General can chair that roundtable. I'm sure China will be happy to participate. You don't expect China to put a table. China absolutely like to go to the table. But the moment President Xi said many times, China is willing to work with the international community to stop this war and then see the peaceful end to that. How clear can that position be? China is willing to participate and to mediate. That's already said many times.
Okay.
Could I just say a couple of points here?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael. Yep.
Well, I think, Henry's kind of waffling between two positions here. One is China play a role as a mediator to some great extent, or China being part of a multilateral process here. But I think we have to keep in mind two things here. One is that I don't think the United States is going to be supportive of China taking a major role in mediating this conflict because it doesn't see China as by any means, as an indifferent, impartial participant in this. So it would not think that China's role in such a negotiation, even if it's multi-party, is going to be that helpful and useful. And secondly, this is not about a conflict between two states that have decided to go to war. It's a conflict of invasion of a state, and the Ukrainians are resisting this invasion, and they do not accept Putin's demands as to how to resolve this situation. And I don't believe Putin himself would accept mediation by other countries in this situation. We're not in anything like that situation right now. Putin is acting in order to try to maximize his level of control within Ukraine through force of arms. And Ukraine is trying to resist this. And Putin is not about to sit down and say, 5 powers, 6 powers can deliberate over this, and whatever you guys come up with sounds good to me. I mean, that's not going to happen. So the first thing you need to do is Putin needs to recognize that he is not going to seize Ukraine. He's not going to dominate and replace this country. And he has to understand that he needs to really be able to adopt a position where he can get himself out of this huge error that he has made with some level of face, but it's going to have to involve some real serious concessions, if not, complete removal from Ukraine. That we're not anywhere near at this point. So I think we really have a lot more that needs to be done here by way of influencing Ukraine. And of course, in the meantime, Putin, and in the meantime, the West needs to restrain itself in the level of, the calls for American troop deployments into Ukraine, the calls for a major escalation on the part of NATO and deploying NATO, all of these things are adding oil to the fire, in my opinion. And the United States is trying to strike a balance here. It is not the aggressor. It is trying to strike a balance here in being able to push Putin's calculus in the right direction by supporting Ukraine. And to say it's simply a battle between Russia and NATO, I think really does. There are certainly elements of this, and that went into the origins of this. But Putin did not need to invade Ukraine with massive military force, killing thousands of people, including children and women, and of course all the combatants. He did not need to do that in order to deal with the problem he had over Ukraine and NATO at this point in time, but he did it. So it needs to be, I think, recognized as to what exactly the situation is here.
Okay, Michael, actually you have answered some of the questions our audience has raised, and feel free to jump in, Elizabeth. Yeah, go ahead. I see you want to say something. Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Michael said. I think that China is not the only party that is not involved and can. I think the Ukrainian officials have rejected some of China's approaches. China suggested some humanitarian aid, and they replied, "We don't need that. We need you to stop Putin." And so I think China is not seen as neutral in Ukraine, and Liao Wang said that China is waiting to mediate, and that's the problem, because other countries have been mediating, like Israel and Turkey, and much more credibly than China could ever do, because rightly or wrongly, the international community sees China as implicitly supporting Putin. And I don't think the UN has a credible role to play either. It's been very distressing to watch the UN Security Council deliberations on this conflict, especially with Russia chairing the meeting. I don't think the UN has a role to play here. And I would agree that Putin is not in a mood to compromise. And I would say, though, that perhaps the US has been too cautious, because he only respects strength. And to the extent that he sees he's not going to be able to accomplish his aims on the battlefield, he might be forced to back off. That's the only way. And Ukraine is in a less mood to compromise despite all the losses, because war crimes, Russia committed war crimes against Ukrainian people. How are they going to accept even this previous situation with Russian controlling parts of Donbass? I don't see that as being on the table. So I think that the conflict, unfortunately, has hardened, and it's much more difficult to resolve. You know, no matter how many parties you have in talks, I think Putin wants as much of Ukraine as he can get on the battlefield, and he's ready to destroy every building in the country to get it, just like he did in Chechnya or in Syria. Yeah. So I don't see much hope for discussions at this stage.
Yeah. Let me bring Bob in here. A number of questions from the audience. I think one directly addressed to you that might have been answered or addressed partially by Michael. They're saying, Dr. Ross, you're too pessimistic. If U.S. Is going to be lowering its posture a little bit and pick up the phone, China may actually actively mediate. But then I just hear from Elizabeth, China may not be the best candidate among the potential options. Although, Elizabeth, I want to emphasize, probably it is a much heavier weight in terms if it does come in with a more neutral position. But Bob, people are asking here to put things a little bit beyond the current context of crisis of Ukraine, Russia. What about the Baltic states? What about Poland? Do you see a wider war? Because as a moderator, I try to refrain from jumping in, but listening to all of you, I just feel that this is a war, existential threat to national integrity of Ukraine. There's no doubt about it, as Michael and Elizabeth pointed out. But others have also pointed out this is equally existential for Russia to win the war. There's no way Putin is going to lose the war, and others say there's no way the US would allow Putin to win the war. And therefore, the Ukrainian people are brave, are putting up quite a resistance, given the disparities of the strength. What is your take strategically on this nobody can back down kind of a situation? And others are asking, what happened historically to 1972? US picked China in order to deal with the then Soviet Union. Now China is China together with Russia is being taken on by the United States at the same time. Sorry to package all these questions from our viewers together. I'm running out of time. Go ahead, Bob. Go ahead. Yeah.
First, on the mediation question, I agree with Michael. The United States wouldn't welcome Chinese mediation. One, they don't see it as a disinterested partner, but two, it would be an expansion of Chinese influence in Europe, which is not something the Americans welcome. Related to that, you cannot have a ceasefire until both sides want a ceasefire. The mediation is designed to determine the terms of a ceasefire. And as you've just suggested, the Russians don't want a ceasefire, they want to win, and the Ukrainians want to fight. So this is not a situation we might say is ripe for mediation. When the two sides want to end the war, the mediation comes in and determines how. Neither side wants to do that. You mentioned Poland and this and that. Yes, everyone in Europe is experiencing higher threat perception. The expansion of Soviet influence on the borders of NATO makes Poland in particular, but other countries quite concerned because the density of European countries, they're all on top of each other, means that the fate of one country influences the security of others. And so we're seeing Sweden and Finland want to join NATO. And one might suggest some caution in that one. If you want to try and avoid a 40-year Cold War in a second 40-year Cold War in Europe, you might want to try and avoid further exacerbating Russian security concerns. But having said that, the United States has increased its troop presence in Poland, the highest since 2015, and they're not going away. So this is a long-term American commitment until the Europeans can build up their own capabilities, which remains in doubt. But we should also recognize it shouldn't take much for the Europeans to deal with the Russian military by themselves. That was the case before Ukraine. It's especially the case after Ukraine, right? But the larger point you're making also is important. The United States, to borrow a term we used to use about China, is once again in a dual adversary policy. We're developing adversarial relations with Russia and China at the same time. Now, we did that during the Cold War in the 50s and 60s, when the world was very different. America was on top of the heap, towering over every country in the world. The Chinese were a basket case during the Maoist era, and the Russians were, for their part, quite weak as well with their economy and even their military capability, apart from their strategic nuclear capabilities. Now the world's very different. We're taking on both simultaneously, and the Chinese are growing very, very quickly with a real economy, not a Maoist economy. But the United States is unable to prioritize. We just can't. And this is a major dilemma for the United States. If you look at the latest defense budget, we want to decrease the number. We are decommissioning over 20 ships is what the Navy wants to do in the latest defense budget. Our Navy is getting smaller, and yet we're going to spend more on the Army in Europe. This is America's dilemma going forward, and there does not seem to be much attention in the United States to dealing with this.
Thank you, Bob. It's a lot to think about. We're running out of time, and appreciate all the questions coming in from our audience. I hope I've summarized most of them, but I want to give Michael and then Elizabeth and finally Henry each maybe within a minute just to sum up your thoughts, wrap up things for many, many things on the table, obviously. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, unfortunately, I do have to run.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said earlier, I think this Ukraine conflict is really triggered a very pivotal moment in great power relations, and it really, depending upon how this plays out, it really could have extremely disastrous consequences. And I don't want to be, overly pessimistic. I mean, I'm not predicting, nuclear war, but I think that China and the United States, as the two sort of dominant contending powers in the world scene today, they both need to reassess their positions in various ways as a result of this conflict, and will particularly need to do so if Putin escalates it much further in ways that really do endanger nuclear conflict. That both sides, I think, need to reassess their policies towards each other to try to be able to avoid and prevent the Ukraine war from really creating a much larger set of problems, assuming the Ukraine war doesn't produce a nuclear conflict. But I'll have to stop there, I think. I need to run. Thank you very much, Wenran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Go ahead, sign off. Thank you for joining us. Elizabeth, go ahead.
I'd just like to add a point about another danger that we haven't really discussed in this conversation, and that is of a nuclear arms race in East Asia. Because I think one of the unfortunate lessons of this conflict is that nuclear deterrence works, and China might be impelled to build up its nuclear forces more in anticipation of a conflict over Taiwan, which could lead to other regional states to do the same. So that would certainly be an unfortunate lesson. And I think one conversation that needs to be held is about nuclear deterrence in East Asia involving China and other countries. And I think that would be a helpful confidence building step. Another point I'd just like to make is that China's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine tells us a lot about Chinese foreign policy. So how committed is China to creating a community of common destiny, as Xi Jinping likes to say? Does China want to play a leading role in global governance? Because so far we don't see that. We see China sitting on the sidelines and supporting a state that is trying to, that is violating the sovereignty of another country. And so, what kind of role is China going to play? Does it want to be the promoter of economic globalization and integration, or is it going to can enable the 19th century ambitions of its partner? So I think that we don't know yet how this is going to play out. There are many voices in China. We'll see which become stronger in the future.
Thank you, Elizabeth, especially bringing in the nuclear dimension. Probably that will be another subject we need to probably focus and discuss. We are, in fact, in a very dangerous situation. We're probably ever closer than even the Cuban Missile Crisis for a nuclear war situation, which is still evolving. Bob, I don't mean to be rude. I do want to give you, even you talked earlier, give us your closing thought briefly before I turn to Henry, please.
I think the sooner this war is over, the better for the people in Ukraine, for European, for China, and for America. I think Michael's right. The American objective right now is not to promote a ceasefire. The American objective is to help the Ukrainian people defeat the Russians. This is exceedingly costly for everyone. And there's a lot of tragedy involved in great power politics in this, and the inability of the great powers to find a way to resolve their differences short of war. Michael's absolutely correct. The conflict of interest in the United States and Russia was real, but the decision to resolve that conflict by Russia by use of force is their decision and no one else's. And the atrocities that Putin is inflicting upon the Ukraine people, no one has responsibility for that other than Putin. Putin has a lot of faces involved, but he needs to extricate himself from this very costly conflict that is not going well. And America is pouring weapons into Ukraine at a rapid pace every day to make this final battle, if you will, something that the Ukrainians can sustain and thus sustain a protracted war, which America seems to feel is in its interest. My fear is that the United States will be similar to Chinese behavior in Cambodia, American behavior in Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation. We will seek to use this as a proxy war to continue to weaken Russian capabilities. The US has the ability to impose a ceasefire, and it doesn't wish to do so. China is going to stay out of this. It's going to stay out of this for the foreseeable future. There's nothing for China to gain whatsoever by trying to intervene militarily, intervene with support of Russia, intervene diplomatically with mediation. That cannot be successful until the two sides want peace, and they don't. And failure is not something that's in China's interest or in anyone's interest. And Michael's right. The United States does not want China to mediate. So China is going to remain on the sideline. It's going to try and minimize the cost to China of this conflict. Now, earlier you asked me about the implications going forward of Sino-Russian cooperation. It's important to recognize that the Chinese are not happy with what Putin did. There's no evidence whatsoever the Chinese knew this was coming. There's, by all means, the National Security Council, Jake Sullivan, has said that Putin likely lied to China about his plans in Ukraine. So Chinese confidence in Putin as a reliable partner is close to zero right now. So China's going to remain on the sideline, both with respect to supporting the United States, at the same time with providing significant material support to Russia. They're going to try and minimize their costs all along. In the meantime, I think we should understand very well that the price being paid by the Ukraine people and the people in Europe is simply devastating.
Well, thank you, Bob. A lot of things you have mentioned. Henry, you can see our American colleagues have been exercising quite a bit of independent thinking, often critical of many sides, including the US government. Your closing thought, please.
Yeah, thank you, Wendan. I think, I share some of the thought that Bob was saying. It's, but again, as I said, this is not really a war between Russia and Ukraine, and it's really a war between Russia and NATO, basically. I mean, as also Michael just said, the U.S. doesn't want probably China to immediately intervene. So it's people in the street thinking, oh, China is a friend of Russia, or maybe can tell Putin to stop it. It's not. You got to have. It's not Ukraine or China, Russia that China can go between. It's really NATO and Russia. So really, you are right. You need when the both sides feel there's a need for that. Then this middleman can be really useful because we are not directly involved into this conflict. That's really a fact. But again, I think whatever the stage of the war, but I think it has to be stopped immediately because it's really danger. I mean, we have to stop this country politics and the military tactics, on both sides. I mean, particularly, on the Russian and on the U.S. add on all the weaponry to Ukraine and the sacrifice of the lives of the Ukrainians, which is really a tragedy of the history in mankind. So I hope that there's a new Minsk moment. If in the past, if Germany, France, and Ukraine and Russia can reach something, why not now? Let's just add more players because it's U.S. is already directly involved now with NATO. So and add China to that to really putting some leeway and save face to the back down. So I think it's important that we need a new Minsk moment and really get this put into the end. We cannot wait this war out of control before we say, okay, let's sit down. We have to sit down now and get everybody to the table and stop this immediately. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Sorry, my apologies for prolonging the session beyond the timeline because we have so many things on the table to discuss. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Michael, who left us already.
Thank you,
and Henry to joining us. Let me concluding by thanking all our audience, and I'm borrowing just an email I received from David Ziwak, professor in Hong Kong, who I think works as the vice president with Center for China Globalization with Henry. And he said, great session. So it is a great session. Great to have you all, and hoping we can come back to discuss related topics again. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.